Let's pause that.
Hello, and thank you very much for coming. I'm very sorry that this was delayed a little bit. Unfortunately, I had a migraine on the day we were originally due to do this. So I'm really glad that some of you at least have managed to come to the next session. So I am Grace. I am a Church of England priest in Manchester, and I am also one of the Diocesan Environment Officers in Manchester Diocese. I have done some environmental campaigning, and I'm also a tutor at a local theological college, and it's just really good to be with you all today. I'm going to try and share my screen. Let's see, there we go, and let's just make sure we're all good. There we go. So the session is entitled Climate Action Is or Climate Action as Mission, and I'm going to be exploring I'm going to look at some of the theory, first of all, behind climate action mission, and then I'm going to look at some of how we can put that into practice, because really what we need to do is take it from our understanding and put it into practice. There's no point in holding back. I have to confess right now, this is also a bit of a plug for my Grove book, which I co-wrote with a fabulous person called Mark Coleman, called Climate Action as Mission. A lot of this will be taken from that, but it expands on it a bit in the Grove book, should you want to go and get it afterwards. So where did this all begin? I'll tell you a bit of where this all began for me in this kind of discussion about climate action and mission. In 2020, in September 2020, a climate action group tweeted to all those Christians saying we should be evangelizing rather than taking action. We are called to do both and so much more. One of the responses to this tweet read, "Mission is one of the things that we're called to do, and the stewardship of creation is another." So this interaction highlighted two assumptions. First, that mission and evangelism were one and the same. And second, that partly as a result of this understanding, that creation care was not thought of as part of mission. I've had, about 2 years ago, I had a conversation with a church leader who really wanted to engage with green issues, but they were worried about the amount of time it would take that would be diverted from mission. So this was really the start of our thinking about how we can discuss and how we can sort of really bring to the attention that climate action is as integral to mission and a part of mission. And I do recognise that I'm doing this and I'm saying this in the middle of a global pandemic, where there's been a lot of loss and a lot of grief, a lot of change. And whilst there's been somewhat of a digital revolution, I mean, we're all here on a webinar, and there've been a lot of restrictions and temporary buildings closures, and there's financial worries. And this comes in the context of a decline in congregation numbers for a number of years. And so there are lots of anxieties about, mission in terms of evangelism, in terms of trying to attract more people to church at the moment. And the missional call to go and make disciples that we hear of in Matthew 28 is as relevant now as it ever has been. And if climate action and creation care is seen as additional to mission, rather than integral to it, it's understandable that churches may be reluctant to engage because they may have other priorities that they wish to engage with. So what I want to argue for strongly here is a recognition that creation care and climate action is mission. And participating in creation care is participating in the whole mission of God, which we're all called to do as Christians. So I'm hopefully going to give you some theological reasoning for this, as well as some practical ideas. So let's just go back to basis with what is mission. So mission, or the Missio Dei, the mission of God, is this speaking of the overflowing of God's being, speaking of the overflowing of the love of God's being and nature into God's purposeful activity in the world. So it's about representing God and pointing people to God. It's an outward energy of a group of contemporary disciples gathered as church to express the good news of Jesus Christ in word or deed. I'm an Anglican. There may be more Anglicans here, and there may be people from other traditions, but I'm going to just talk about the Anglican 5 marks of mission, just to sort of frame some of the understanding about mission, because they've actually a really important statement on mission. They express the Anglican Communion's common commitment to and understanding of God's holistic and integral mission. So we have the 5 marks of mission there. Some of you may be very familiar with them. Some of you may not be so. You can find them quite easily by Googling them if you need to look them up afterwards. And whilst this is really helpful because it kind of shapes and articulates what we mean by mission, it does make the concept of mission very easy, accessible. I do have a couple of issues with it in that there's a danger that each mark can be seen in isolation rather than seeing as being integral with each other. So we can sometimes see mission as being taking one of the marks and for one thing and one of the marks for something else, rather than recognizing mission as an integral, holistic thing. It's quite often the case, particularly with creation care. Often the 5th mark of mission, this last one, to safeguard the integrity of creation, is seen as the mark for creation care and the mark for creation care and mission. But I want to encourage us to think about how much more holistically about mission and how the 5 marks of mission are almost like strands of a plait that are all woven together, and that climate action is woven through all 5 marks of mission, rather than just being seen as the last mark. So one of the questions that we wanted to address was, why is creation care not seen as a missional priority or even seen as mission? And there are a couple of reasons for that, which I'll explain as we go on. Some of the reasons are that it's not seen as something that will bring people in to church. And its creation is seen as something out there and nature and not something we are part of. There is a political nature to some climate action that makes some people quite nervous maybe about engaging with it. And there is this thing called vertical transcendence, which I'll explain. That's a theological term, and I'll explain that a bit again, why that might feed into some of our reluctance maybe to engage with climate action. So the effect of splitting mission into different sections is that for the case of creation care, its role in the whole mission of God can end up being limited. And whilst this 5th mark of mission is helpful, it clearly sets creation and climate care as apart from the other marks of mission. So if we look at the first 2 marks of mission, which you can see there on the screen, to proclaim the good news of the kingdom and to teach, baptize and nurture new believers, when we talk about creation as a gift from God, that's preaching the good news. And when teaching new people about scripture and faith. In John 3:16, we often hear the words, for God so loved the world. And the word there that's actually used for world means cosmos, means the whole world, not just us necessarily as humans, but the whole of the created world. So there is this good news, this sense that God so loved the whole of created world that he gave his only son to redeem and save the whole of created world, not just us humans. Youthscape research, there's been some Youthscape research that was done recently by Tear Fund, commissioned by Tear Fund, which said that only 1 out of 10 14 to 19-year-olds thought their church was doing enough on climate change. If we really want to nurture and baptize and teach new believers, if we want to proclaim the good news, we really need to be considering how we are weaving in creation care into all aspects of our church life, particularly because these are concerns that are particularly relevant to our young people. This is a common concern amongst people of all faith and none. So it's actually a really great way to build relationships and engage people. If we want to start building those bridges between ourselves and maybe people who are on the margins of church, this subject of creation care is something that really connects with a lot of people. And there are a lot of creation care Bible studies and resources that can be used in our teaching and nurturing of new believers too. The 3rd mark of mission is to respond to human need by loving service. Now, I've already mentioned that creation includes all created things. Humans are part of creation, and loving our neighbour, human and non-human, is about loving creation. And the climate crisis, as we know, is already taking people's lives and livelihoods. And it's also rendering traditional methods of tackling poverty as inadequate. I'm going to give you one example of this. This is the LOUDA Dam in BURKINO, FASO. This was built in 1959 to provide water and farming for people in the area, up to 206 neighbouring villages. But in recent times, the rains have been more erratic due to the changes in the climate. So the water levels in the dam have been much lower, which has meant that this traditional way of this solution that was put in place to help people access water is now, because of the climate, not sufficient. Addressing climate change is about addressing issues which are putting impoverished people into critical poverty. So this is about, it's really about meeting human need with loving service. This fourth mark of mission, to transform the structures of society, to challenge violence of every kind and pursue peace and reconciliation. The climate emergency is a matter of climate justice. The wealthiest 1% of the world's population are responsible for the emission of more than twice as much carbon dioxide as the poorer half of the world from the 1990 to 2015. The way we're living is unjust. And one of our calls, our missional calls, is to seek to transform these unjust structures. As it says in Isaiah, to learn to do good, to seek justice, correct oppression, bring justice to the fatherless, and to please the widows, the widow's cause. Speaking out about the injustice is part of our calling as Christians to MP, especially in the run-up to COP26. And we can get involved in many different ways. There are lots of different organisations out there, a couple that I've put on there, Tear Fund, Christian Aid, the Unchristian Climate Network, which I'll talk about a bit later. But these are ways in which we can gather as Christians to speak out. Ruth Valerio, in her Grove book that she wrote called COVID-19, Environment, Justice and Future, outlines how Christians and churches need to engage with governments on issues of climate emergency and poverty, because activism and truth-telling, however this is lived out, is a crucial part of our missional call. The fifth mark of mission, to strive to conserve the integrity of creation, to sustain and renew the earth. This was added later. This was actually added about, I can't remember how long after, but it was added a little while after the first 4 marks of mission. And sometimes, therefore, it's seen as a bit of an add-on rather than integral to. There is a sort of understanding sometimes that when the day of judgment comes, or when the new creation comes, it will be in a different place, that we will go to a different place. And this comes from understanding and sort of teaching that's happened from about a century or so ago. But the new creation isn't a matter of us being taken to a new place, but rather of Jesus coming back to the present world and transforming it afresh. The new heaven and the new earth, as described in the book of Revelation, not a metaphor for heaven being somewhere else, but the emphasis on a new earth, this earth being renewed and restored and transformed, and perhaps in a way resurrected. So part of our Missio Dei, part of our calling to participate in the Missio Dei, is to build for the coming of the kingdom here on earth, to participate in God's active creation. The phrase, "your will be done on earth as it is in heaven," from the Lord's Prayer, is set in the present tense. God's will for us to tend to creation is a present reality and an ongoing calling to participate in the Missio Dei. Christians are called to serve God here in the present, as much as we are to be mindful of what happens in the future, to continually act and preserve creation now as part of the renewal and the regeneration of creation. In the book of Revelation, it lies a reminder that God is continually present and active now within creation. "I am making all things new," it says in Revelations 21. And as God's image bearers, we're called to do the same. So that's a bit of a background really into some of the thinking behind why climate action is mission in a much larger sense of the word, rather than just focusing on the 5th mark of mission. What I want to do now is give you some practical outworkings from my own context and from other people's contexts that I've had the privilege to talk to people about, so that you can see for yourselves some practical solutions, some practical ideas about how we can participate in the Missio Dei. So, what is climate action? Something I've been talking about quite a lot in this webinar already. So practical climate action incorporates all actions that we take personally and that institutions and organisations take to actively reduce our carbon footprint, care for land and wildlife. And it can be done in a number of ways. Foundationally, we're Christians, we're people of faith, and we are sustained and renewed and resourced in our worship and prayer. So we can think on a very practical level, how can our worship and prayer reflect our desire to reduce our carbon footprint and care for the land and the wildlife and participate in this Missio Dei? Other practical things that we can do that are really part of God's mission, even though, or the mission of God and the mission of caring for creation, that we don't often think of because they're quite practical and a bit mundane, are things like the measuring our carbon footprint through the energy footprint tool, for example, or other tools. Looking at our heating and our insulation, recycling, the use of our land, how we're using our church land, what we're eating and how we're travelling. Practical action can be engaging with things like Eco Church programme, which is a brilliant framework by which we can look at how our churches and as individuals, we can address some of these ecological issues. Doing nature counts in our land. There was the Count for Nature earlier this year, which was a wonderful opportunity to use our green spaces and the land that we have in church to open it up to the community and just invite people to sit in our church land and count the nature and just enjoy being there. So thinking about how we can use the spaces that we have as community resources to bring people together in the reduction of carbon and the care of biodiversity. Got some pictures here of some of the things that people have done in the context that in Manchester. So this first picture here, you can see two women digging. This was a piece of wasteland in the middle of a council estate. It was just being ignored, really. And what the local church did was transform it into a place that grew lots of wildflowers. There was a prayer garden there, and it became a space where they did things like forest church as well. So they just used the space that they had, or that was in the estate, and really sort of brought it to life again in a way that was really nourishing for the community. In the bottom corner, we can see a very small greenhouse that a church that doesn't have a lot of land managed to sort of construct a small greenhouse where they grow plants and so forth, and fruit and food that they can then pass on to their congregations and the community. I'm going to try and attempt to show you a video of some eco-fests that I have helped to take part in the churches where I serve, just to give you an idea of some of the other practical ways in which we might be able to engage with practical climate action.
So I'm Judith, I'm from Whalley Range Climate Action Group. We are doing a bit of an experiment today, which is we're asking people to try and think about what a climate safe future Whalley Range might be like. One where we're no longer burning fossil fuels.
It's been really interesting. We've been talking about what we would see as a vision for Whalley Range in a climate safe future.
This is the good fight that needs to be fought now. Eco, sustainability, climate change. It's very much in people's minds that we need to be aware of our impact.
This one is about climate, racism and inclusion.
Yeah, so I'm here really to talk to you about why you might choose veganism. If
We're having a conversation now all about cycling.
I originate from South Africa, I've lived in this country now for the last 20 years, and of course in the south, the global south, I've seen firsthand the impact of climate change and with the devastating floods and droughts.
It is a social, racial justice issue.
Thinking about our environment, our clean air, the safety of our streets is something that local residents can do something about.
And what we're trying to do is connect concerned citizens across the city to try and push for more radical and more urgent action.
But yeah, I definitely find that my faith and the way that I connect with God, the way that I express who I am and my spirituality is really impacted when I'm out there on a bike.
But I'd like to think of myself not just as an activist, rather as a disciple. It's part of my discipleship to be active in Christian justice work, Christian prayer for justice, working for peace. That's part and parcel of my Christian life.
There we go. So that just gives you a little bit of an idea of some of the things that we've done, how we've used our spaces in sort of trying to engage community together. So looking at how we can outreach to people and how we can use the spaces that we've got. I think it's really important that as part of our response, our missional response to the climate emergency, is that we recognise the impacts of climate grief and anxiety, which is very much growing in this population. And there are some initiatives out there, such as Green Christians Borrowed Time, which are ways in which churches can provide circles of support and public rituals where people can connect to that emotional, those spiritual challenges which now confront us all. And again, our churches can be those sanctuaries, those safe spaces for grief expression and spaces where hope is spoken. And we can really be, this can be a really important and profound part of our mission and the way in which we seek to serve our communities. I was really taken when I went to, I'm going to show you a little snap in a minute of something that I went to a few months ago, where a space was used as a place of communal lament and grief, not about climate change, but something else. Hopefully some of you might recognise it when I show it in a few moments' time. And I was just really struck by this and thinking about how we could, as churches, use our spaces for communal gatherings, for such things. So I'll just show you the video. It's only a short video, but some of you may remember this. So this was the mural that was the Marcus Rashford mural, and after the football this year, when there was all the racism that came out, the awful racism, people really started to gather in force at this mural, and it was a place of outpouring of support and a place of outpouring of grief and lament, and also became a place of hope. And it just made me think, I wondered about how we could, in our own church spaces, create spaces of, where people could feel comfortable about expressing their grief and lament over what's happening to our climate, and in that create spaces of hope, that sense of community coming together and sharing in this and striving to do something together for change. So I was just really struck by how Marcus Rashford's mural became one of those spaces and places where people gathered, and just wondered how we could use our own church spaces in similar ways. Oh, there we go. Now, there is another side to sort of climate action, that's the more prophetic activism. And this activism is rooted in prayer and discernment and a sense of calling that compels individuals and churches maybe who undertake it to speak out and challenge actions which do not reflect the way of God. So for things like this, we could be thinking about, writing to our MP, which is really important, particularly at the moment, as in the run-up to COP, signing a petition, going on an organised march or protest, speaking out publicly, criticising where appropriate, if there's particular policies, and calling for change. And for those who feel that this is their calling, participating in non-violent direct action or being arrested for the cause. Now, obviously, for some of these things, people have degrees of level of how they feel about this. And what I would say about any kind of action in this for is that this is very much, any kind of action here is very much rooted in prayer and discernment, in our own sort of relationship with God and where we think God may be calling us to. So for some people, that may be to participate in the non-violent direct action. For some people, it may be, gathering people together to speak to their MP. There are different ways in which this kind of prophetic activism and using our prophetic voice can be heard. And we can discern for ourselves where we feel that God may be calling us to in this particular realm. Some of the things that have fallen under the prophetic activism, so to speak, umbrella. For instance, the Young Christian Climate Network, some of you may have heard of them. They're a group of young Christians from age 18 to 30. They've been doing a relay that started off after the G7 meeting in June in Cornwall and is going to finish in Glasgow when COP starts next week. Fantastic relay that's organised and galvanised people across the country and really raised the issue across the country as they've been walking. And they've been having residencies in various cities along the way where they've been sharing their stories. They came to Manchester not so long ago. And as a result of them coming to Manchester, one of the primary schools that joined in one of the events that we had, their whole group, their whole class then wrote to their local MP, Jake Berry, to ask their MP what they were doing in terms of climate action. So these are primary school children being inspired to use their voice and being empowered to remember that they have a voice and see how they can use that for climate action. Other things that I've been involved in, a couple of years ago, I rewrote some rewrote some Christmas carols and gave them a sort of a climate emergency slant, and we went around a local shopping centres and just did carol singing at Christmas, but the carols were slightly different. The tunes were the same, but the words were slightly different, and it actually engaged quite a lot of people in conversation because they would walk past and think, oh, this is lovely carol singing, let's stop and listen, and then they'd hear the words and they think, oh, this is something quite different. And so we had quite a lot of conversations. Again, quite a nice thing to do as a group of people, to get out and sing. In our present time with COVID, it's quite, if we spread out and sung outside, it's possibly one of the actions that we could still do. And it also really engaged people in discussions about what this meant and why we were doing it as Christians. This was pre-COVID, probably about 6 weeks before COVID really hit. This is my church in Moss Side, and here we held our first ever Moss Side climate emergency meeting. It was a public climate emergency meeting, and we had all the local councillors came. The gentleman talking at the moment is one of the local councillors, and we had people from all over the community. We had students, you can just see some school children there, we had people from youth clubs, and they all came together whilst we held this public climate emergency meeting so they could have their voice and they could speak to councillors and to each other about what they wanted to do about the climate emergency. So if we have our spaces like this is a great way to use our spaces and to really bring together community as one in a way of climate action. And this is a prayer vigil. I think prayer underpins everything that we should be doing in terms of mission. And so we just held a prayer vigil in the city centre. And we prayed. It was an interfaith prayer vigil. We had a rabbi with us and an imam with us as well. And we just shared prayers together. And it was a really holy space, but it was right in the city centre. So again, people were walking past, asking us what was going on, what we were doing. We made some little prayer flags, as you can see there. But just a really simple way of bringing something of our Christian faith and what our calling into the public sphere. So where to start? Well, the first thing I would always say, which I've not put on here, but I would always say, is pray. Where are you being called? What is God saying to you and your church community at this time? And then look and listen within your context. What's happening? What are the issues in your local context? What are the potential connections? What might God already be doing? Build a team so that you can do this together. Engage with something like the Eco Church programme, because it does give you a really good framework from which to work. Build climate action into the mission action plan. Most of us in our churches have some form of mission action plan. Build it all the way through. Think about, often at the beginning, it gives a space for what your values or your ethos or your focus is. Build climate action straight into that from the beginning. So it is an integral part of your mission action plan. Explore ways through prayer and through discussion in which your church can use its prophetic voice as well as its practical action. And do allow space for rest. This isn't easy work. We all need to be able to support each other in rest. And spaces where possible for expressions of grief and lament, because this can be hard and sometimes it can be quite disappointing. So it's really important that we acknowledge that and we build spaces in for rest and for grief and lament. Now, I've gone through that at a million miles an hour because I know we were a bit late starting and I wanted to make sure we had a little bit of time for you to feedback, maybe share some things that you're already doing. And if you are doing anything that you think, you could share with others, let's encourage each other, pop it in the chat, anything that you might be doing, because it's always really good to sort of hear what other people are doing and be inspired by other people. And also just have to think about how is climate action viewed in your context? Is it integral to mission or is it seen as something separate? And how might you in your context participate in this Missio Dei through creation care and climate action? I'm going to leave it there. I'll stop sharing my screen and hopefully we'll have some comments and questions.
Thanks, Grace. That's a lot to think about there, and a really lovely. I just love seeing those stories and the actions and people really getting stuck in. It really great to see. People have already put a couple of comments in the chat about things they've been involved in, so please keep doing that and then everyone can see them. And we have got a few questions, so I'm going to start with an easy one. Will the recording of this webinar be posted on YouTube? I can answer that one. We've had a series of 4 webinars for the season of creation, and this is the last one. So now this one is done. We will post them all on YouTube, and I will send a link to everyone who signed up, not just the people who are here, but everyone who signed up. So even those who couldn't make it today. And we're going to go for another easy one next. Grace, would you be willing to share your climate carol words?
Yes, I've just seen a comment. Absolutely. They should be already on the Christian Climate Action website, but I will maybe the easiest way to do that, Joe, is to email it to you.
Yeah, if you email me the link even, then
yeah,
we can
that's fine.
I think Grace will share her slides with me afterwards and I'll send them all out to you, and I can send, if she sends me the link to the carol words, I put that there. Please bear with me, you might guess it's a slightly busy time with COP in just over a week, but we will get there. Okay, let's get to something a little bit more meaty. Now, Charles is asking something about anthropocentrism to help the Church of England with climate change and other social issues such as child poverty. And I think, there's a bit more to this, which is, I guess the question really, without going into too technical detail, is where does an anthropocentric view fit into this? Is it a helpful view? Is it a not helpful view? Where does it fit?
Well, I noticed that Charles said something about Pope Francis's approach to anthropocentrism, which Charles, if you're able to just say a little bit more about that, just to make sure I'm answering the right question, that would be really helpful. But in terms of, the problem has been historically that we have been very anthropocentric in the way that we have looked at the world and creation and seen it as something for us and something for us to use without really recognising our need to be more sort of at one, so to speak, with creation. I think Ruth Valeria made this point in one of her books, and I wish I could remember which one, where she said, it is important that we recognise, the creation texts do say that humans do have a special role within creation, and that role is one of responsibility and stewardship, and we are image bearers of God. And one of the problems that has been with the word stewardship and how it's been used, it has been in the past been translated into dominion and to rule over, and therefore we've almost given ourselves permission sometimes to do with creation what we feel we would like to do because we've given this permission to have dominion. What I would say to that is that we are also made in God's image, to reflect God's image in this world, and therefore and treat creation in a way that reflects God's own way of treating and cherishing and caring for creation. So in that respect, some of how we have come to approach creation from a human-centered perspective has been quite damaging, and I think we really do need to start thinking of remembering that we are image bearers of God and called to be the hands, feet, and voices of God in this world, and to direct people to that, who God what God is calling us to how God is calling us to live in creation.
Thanks. There's an awful lot to unpack there, isn't there? Maybe we need a whole nother session on it. Yeah, and I would agree. This understanding that we have the image of God in us and imbues every human being with that sort of intrinsic value right from the start. Yeah, thank you. Okay, this one's a little bit more straightforward. How effective is sending template emails to MPs?
That's actually a really good question. And there has been, I've had a few discussions with MPs recently that have said that particularly if they get lots and lots of template email, they're less likely to engage. On the one hand, getting lots of template emails tells the MP something. It tells the MP that there are lots of people out there who are really, keen and passionate about this. On the other hand, sometimes writing your own letter to the MP, as well as doing the template emails, may have more of an impact. So I would possibly suggest a belt and braces approach to this, because I do think that the Young Christian Climate Network, particularly at the moment, have got a Make Your Voice Heard link, and you can contact your local MP through that very easily. And I think that's an effective way of just letting the MP know the volume of people who are really passionate about this. But if you want to do something more direct and possibly want to get a response, then maybe also alongside that, write your own personal email to them.
I would definitely endorse that, and if you can bear it and you find the address, put something actual physical in the post.
Yes,
that happens less and less, and if you can make a card and it stands out, then they really notice. Yeah. Okay, so Dawn is asking about the meeting that you had with your local councils when you declared a climate emergency. Can you tell us a bit more how you organised it and who came, and did you have good take up, that kind of thing?
Yeah, that came after the videos of the EcoFest, the first EcoFest that we had. Basically, my dream was we had this space, and I just thought, let's open it to the community, and let's see how, let's just let the community groups have this space to be able to showcase what they are doing and share their ideas. And so we had a lot of community members then come in, as well as and so we invited local councillors to that. And that first EcoFest, opening our space and just allowing it to be a resource for the community, really built up some fantastic links with our local councillors and our local community groups. And then it was our local councillor who actually said to me, who actually emailed following that, saying, we want to have a public climate emergency meeting where we declare a climate emergency in Moss Side. Can we use your church? So actually the request came originally from the councillors themselves, having been part of the EcoFest. And then we sent out, obviously we were really happy to host this. And then together we contacted schools, students. We happen to be in a student area as well, and all local residents through all our various networks, and said, please come along to this. And really, the response was just absolutely phenomenal. I mean, the church was absolutely packed, all ages. And I think how it happened though was by building up those links beforehand, and by saying, we've got, let's see what resources we've got. Let's see how we can, support and help communities in what they're trying to do by sharing what resources we have. And through that, we really built up some good relationships.
Thanks. So it's just the meeting on its own was not just the whole story, it's all the stuff that happened before that really made the difference. Yeah, it's a bit of a journey, isn't it, that we have to go on. Yeah. And this links into this question, I think, a little bit. I feel the really hard thing is to reach those of the public who are not yet engaged by the climate crisis. Any ideas about how we get to meet them?
I think that's really key. I think there are less and less members of the public who aren't engaged, even if they're maybe not actively and voicing that engagement. Lots of people in our communities are concerned in many different ways, and I think being a visible presence. Sometimes what we do, first of all, finding out what's going on already, if there happens to be stuff going on, even if it's a local litter picking group. And going along and just joining in and supporting them. And then if you're out picking litter and as a group, then people may stop and ask you questions or may stop and have conversations, and that's how these things happen. So I'm very conscious of using our spaces as community resources, but also being out in community. So it's a really hard job, but I'm often in cafes and in the local parks, in schools, wherever there's people, really, just trying to get out and about, doing activities, gardening, planting. The Churches Count for Nature was a really interesting one. We don't have a big churchyard. We have a small bit of grass at the front of our church, but we advertised in all the local Facebook groups saying, come and sit in our small bit of churchyard and count the nature. And we had a lot of people from the community come and do just that. So I guess it's connecting, building those relationships, sharing ideas via the community Facebook groups and the community, if you happen to be on Facebook or Twitter or anything like that, and being a visible presence and just seeing how we can start those conversations off.
Yeah. And I just want to add in something in the chat in response. It says there are lots of people out there who are engaged by the climate crisis, and you can work with them, and that's where you start, which is what you said, like find if there was a litter picking group. So, yeah,
absolutely.
Someone says, I've put poetry trails out in our churchyard for snowdrop and bluebell seasons. I think some climate poetry might make a good trail during the COP conference. Do you have a Facebook page where people share ideas, just like we had for Lent and Easter this year?
That's a great, I think poetry and climate poetry would be fantastic. I don't know where the best Facebook page or place would be for that, but that sounds absolutely fantastic. I love that idea. We have a Manchester Eco Diocese Facebook page where we do share ideas through the diocese. I don't know whether there's any other Facebook pages that you know of, Joan?
So I'm connected with a Facebook page called Greening the Church, and that's originated in Chelmsford Diocese, but it's definitely not just stuck with Chelmsford Diocese. So yeah, it's called Greening the Church. I'm sure you'd find it if you look for that.
And there are like Green Christian
yes.
has, and things like that. They all have their Facebook pages too. But it might be worth thinking about setting up one that's particularly for things that we can do in COP. One of the things that we're doing during COP is we're doing compling for COP. And every evening at 9 p.m, we're going to be live streaming to YouTube a simple compling service during COP that we can hold in prayer. And again, that's gained much wider interest than just our churches already, and local community groups are already retweeting that as something very simple to offer, but just that thing of coming together as a community every day and just praying for what's going on at COP26.
That sounds brilliant. That we really, really appreciated. Another comment about the poetry. Reading eco-fiction is also helpful in developing our vision. Do you have a recommendation for eco-fiction?
Do you know, I don't, but it's so true. And I would, there's more being said these days, I think, about eco-fiction and needing to bring the climate issues into sort of the fore. Most of the eco books I read, unfortunately, are theology and factual. There's some wonderful stuff done by Robert Macfarlane. Let me just find it here, which I often take into schools. It's not fiction. Robert Macfarlane and Jackie Morris, called The Lost Words.
Oh, yes.
It's a beautiful book, and it's just sort of bringing to life some of the words that we made, the nature words that we've kind of lost in our language over the years. And there's also actually an album called the Lost Words album, which is just beautiful. But I don't know of any actual fiction. I don't. If anybody does, again, put it in the chat. This is definitely a place for sharing.
I would recommend Flight Behaviour by Barbara Kingsolver.
Now,
so some of you have probably read the Poisonwood Bible, but Flight Behaviour, it's actually a beautiful novel. Yeah, I really, really recommend that. And there's another question. I'm going to take this one myself, Grace, rather than throw this one at you. Some of the aspects of being an eco-church cost, e.g. getting a heat pump for heating. The government have just announced a grant for households. Do you know if this will be extended to church groups and buildings? So I'll make two answers to that. One is, yes, heat pumps do cost money, but eco-church covers such a wide range of other things. Please, please, please don't be put off by the cost. Do everything else that you can do while you're saving up. And the second thing about will this be extended to church groups and buildings? At the moment, it hasn't been, but that is something that we are trying to use our influence as an established church. This is the one time when we might actually think it's worth being established, because we do have a little bit of a relationship with government. So we are trying to encourage the government to remember public buildings and places of worship when they make policy. I can't promise at all, but we're doing what we can in our little space.
I would encourage, just encourage about the, the eco-church thing. Moss Side and Whalley Range, we're not rich churches. In fact, we've got very, very high pockets of deprivation in both our areas, and we were the first churches in Manchester, urban churches in Manchester, to get the Silver Eco Award. Just shows that you don't need money, a lot of money, to make these simple changes in your church life that can make a really big difference. Yes, some of the things around heating, I have no idea how we'll do that, but there are lots of other ways in which you can really achieve quite substantial things without having to spend too much money.
Lovely. Okay, so we have actually come to the end. Oh, people are putting up their titles for eco-fiction, so keep going with that. That's brilliant. And yeah, Christine Jack said she's got an eco book group going, and in fact so with Christian Aid. I think that's the Christian Aid one's probably a bit broader than environment issues, but they've got a Facebook book group going, so look out for that. I'm just going to finish, unless anything pops up in the last 3 minutes. I was talking to somebody on yesterday about eco-church, and their comment was, when you're getting stuck into something physical and you're working, and you've both got your hands in the soil and your hands are getting dirty, and you don't have to speak and you have this companionable silence, but the conversations that grow and flow while you're there working side by side have really enriched their church and enriched their relationships with people who don't normally come to church. And so this idea that climate action is opposite to mission or detrimental to mission is really a fallacy. And I likened it to that moment, if you've got teenagers, the best conversations are when you're driving somewhere, when you're side by side in the car and you don't have to stare each other in the eye, and then they tell you their woes or their loves or their joys. So that sort of doing stuff together really makes a difference to how you build relationships. So that's my little insight for today.
I totally agree. Yeah.
Okay, Grace, thank you so much. I'll get the slides off you at some point. We'll share them around. The whole series will go on YouTube now that we finished it, and I'll tell everyone where I've put it. And then I hope you will be able to enjoy them and share them again. And thank you very much for coming, everyone. Thank you.